What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this special video. This video is the Fauna Skills Lab video. It's going to take you through a wide plethora of fauna questions that you guys had. So I took every response from YouTube comments, Discord, Twitter and put them in here. So if you're excited to learn more things about fauna, stick around. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to Fauna for sponsoring this video. They're the reason we're doing this, and if there's something specific you want to know about fauna that's not covered in this video, make sure to drop a comment because we have one more video left. Also, while you're here, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're going to try and hit 5K by the end of the year. So without further ado, let's get into this skills lab. We are back in the fauna dashboard, and I've created this new database here called Skills Lab, and we're going to use this throughout this video talking about each piece individually. So I've clicked on Skills Lab, and as you can see, we don't have any collections or anything currently. So what we want to do first is we want to be able to use GraphQL. Now the way that GraphQL works with fauna is you need to import some sort of schema either in a GQL file or a GraphQL file that describes how the data should look. So I've already created one, but I'm going to go through and explain exactly how that works before we import the schema. So let's look at Visual Studio Code, and I have the schema here. So I've created the schema based on the to-dos that I created in the previous video, which I'll throw a card on screen if you haven't seen it. It goes through and explains how to use SQL with JavaScript, but let's talk about this schema. So if you've never seen a GraphQL schema before, you'll see there's two different things here. There's a type and there's also this thing called query. So the type to do explains exactly how the data should look for each individual to do in our application. So as you can see, I have something called title, note, created at, updated at, and the completed Boolean. So the title, note, and created at have this exclamation point at the end, and that means it is required for you to create a to-do. You must have those things as minimum. Then we have this thing down here called query. And you're probably wondering what this does. Well, the first one says, I want to be able to use a query that returns the to-do. So this says all to-dos, and it's going to return a type of to-do. Now this one is a to-dos by completed. So essentially what it is saying here is if I wanted to get all the to-dos that have been completed or maybe not completed, I can send along something like a Boolean here, and you're going to return the to-dos back to me. So those are the schemas that we're going to use for this example. So what I'm going to do is going to go back to our window here in Chrome and say import schema, select that file that's on my desktop, wait about 2 seconds, and it's done. So I'm going to delete this mutation for now, and let's talk about what's happened since we've imported this. One thing you'll notice, there's now this collection here, and there's also these two new indexes, and those indexes are reflected by those two names in the queries. We have one called all to-dos and one called to-dos by completed, and it's telling us, hey, data.completed, we can put something in here, similar to the previous video. We can do something like false and hit here. It's going to say no results found right now, and that's because we don't have anything in our collection. So our collection right now is empty. So I'm going to show you in the GraphQL playground how you can use mutations to create new to-dos. So now we can create a query to insert a to-do into our database. So to do that, we're going to use something called mutation. And mutation essentially does what it sounds like. It says, hey, I'm going to mutate something on your database, whether that's an insert, an update, anything like that. That's what a mutation is for. So we can just call it whatever we want. So we just say create to do. And then inside of here is where we actually do the functionality. So if you press the letter C, for example, you'll see IntelliSense is available. So it says create a new document in the collection of to do. And that's exactly what we want to do. Then we're going to put a set of parentheses here, and it's going to tell us you probably want data, which is the input for the to-dos, and that's definitely what we want. Then we're going to put a colon here, and then a set of curly braces, and that's where we get to put our data. So we can say title, and we'll say GraphQL is easy with Fauna, and then note, we'll say keep watching, plenty to learn. And then the only other thing that was required originally was the created at. So the way created at works is it is a time here. So time is an option that's offered. And the way that time works is it uses a date timestamp. So it'll be year, month, day, and then the time, which is in hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. So it will be 2021, 09, 11, then the letter T for time, and then we get our hours in here. So we could do 000000.0000Z. And then we'll put it completed as false. And at that point, we need to tell it what we want returned. So we open a second set of curly braces here, and then we can say, return the title and the note. And then if we hit this play button here, what should happen is it should be able to execute, and it will return both the title and the note. And as you can see over here, that's what's been returned, which is what we asked for. So now if we go to our collections here, you can see that this has been inserted, and we have this created at, which has a timestamp. It gives us the reference. It gives us an actual timestamp, the title, note, and if it's completed. So now if we look at our indexes, all to-dos returns immediately that one. And if we set this to FQL and type the word false and hit query, you can now see that that's being returned. But what if we want to essentially do that in GraphQL? So if you go back to the GraphQL playground here, and let me just add a couple other notes. Let's try this is completed. Thanks so much. And I'll set this to true and then insert it into the database. And now we have two options that we can test out. So first, let's try getting all of the to-dos. So the way that that works is we use the word query, and a query does what it sounds like. It queries data, and let's say find all to-dos. And then we can do this. So if you hit Control and space, you'll get all of the options on screen, and we want to use all to-dos. So if I select all to-dos and then tell it I want the data, which is a to-do element, and then tell it what I want back. So I can do _ID, maybe the title, the note, and is it completed? And if I hit play now, we should get two results here. So all to-dos, data, and then we have false and true. So that gives us all of the to-dos, but what if we want to do the query where we say, hey, we only want the ones that are completed? So we can do another new query here and say, find completed. And in the same vein, we can do Control space, and that gives us all the options. And we want this to-dos by completed flag. And then we need to pass something in here, which is completed. And we will do false here. And then we'll tell it what we want returned. So we can just do data, and we'll say ID. We'll take the title, and we'll take completed. And if we hit play, you can see this one is false. This one has not been completed. And if I update this to true, you now have that option. So that's fairly simple stuff about how GraphQL can be used. So if you're wondering how does this sort of translate into maybe an application of your choice, whether it's Next.js or something else. So this GraphQL endpoint can be used, and what you do is you send a bearer token down and tell it, hey, this is my bearer token, which you can create a token under the security, just like you did for the FQL version. You send down the key, and then that will query only your data from your collections. But then you can use anything like Apollo or whatever you prefer as your GraphQL client of choice. Relationships are a really important part of any database. We need to know who owns what or what belongs to who. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new collection here called users. And these users are going to contain just a single user, and we'll just call it James. And we're going to use that to essentially update some of these documents here and use a reference to denote who owns what. So before we get started, we should talk about this reference here. So this reference has this ID number, and as you can see, it's pretty long, and it also has the collection that it belongs to. Now, without the collection, this ID is basically useless to people. But if we reference this as a variable, for example, ref collection to do and this number, we'll be able to retrieve the data based upon that. So in theory, if we create a new collection called users and have a user there, it's also going to have a reference to itself. And we can use that reference to add a new data point that will reference that, and then we can use either indexes or a query to collect that data. So first, let's create a new collection, and we'll call it users, and hit save. And then we'll create a new document here. And I'm just going to use the JavaScript based editor here. So we can just create a user, and I'll call myself James. And then we'll give ourselves a user ID. And we'll just say James _ Perkins, and we'll hit save. So we've created this new document now. So if you go back to the users collection, you can see that we have a reference and we have the data that we could possibly need. So I'm going to copy this reference, and just to give you an idea, we're going to edit this collection here and this document. We're going to add another line, and we're going to say user ref, and then I'm going to paste in this and remove the ref at the beginning, add a comma, and hit save. Now this document now technically belongs to this user. So now we can create, let's say, an index, for example, that references this ref and says, hey, if this person has this ref, return all the data for it. So we can create a new index here and say new index, select the collection, so we want to do, and the index name will be get all to-dos by user, and the terms here will be user ref. And if you just put user ref and hit save, it will add data.userref, and then we can hit save. And now we have this get all to-dos by user. So if I go back to my collection and look at this again and just copy this ref and use it in this index here. So go get to-dos by user. And this is going to be an FQL because we're referencing something that is more complex than just a string. And if I paste this in and hit search, you will see that this is the only one that is returned. So now we have a relationship between two collections here. So if we were to update some code, or we were to essentially create this in the application from the previous video, you'd be able to see that we could use this user ref to say, hey, only give me data that belongs to a specific user. Now this is super important. Obviously, we don't want just any Joe Schmo being able to grab data. And if you were using the functionality of Fauna where you can have authentication, which we'll be covering in the next video, you'll be able to take that and use that as part of your queries to enable you to protect each document as it's needed. We've talked about relationships and how those kind of work with Fauna, but the problem with this is if you need to, for example, in our example here, and you have a user, you're going to have to write a query that asks for the user every time. And then once you have that data, you're going to have to then ask again, hey, Fauna, can you go and get all of the to-dos for this user? So what we can do is create a new index here, and we'll call for users, and we'll just call it get by ID, and the term will just be user ID. Now this gives us the ability to get anything that has a user ID. So for example, James Perkins, search for that, the user is returned, and we get the data and the reference. So there's this thing in Fauna called functions, and essentially if you're using the same piece of code hundreds of times, it's better to just use a function, and it makes it reusable. You don't have to transfer a load of data back and forth from your network, and essentially it's housed on Fauna. It does the whatever the function is and then returns the data as a result of that. So what we can do is create a function here that essentially just grabs a user by ID, and then we can leverage that user by ID to return all of the to-dos. So the way that functions work, they're built with this function body here. So you have something called a query, lambda, and then something else happens. So the query part is telling you we're going to do a query here. The lambda part is the lambda function that you're going to run. And then anything after this is where a function would run. And this x here is a variable. So if I show you what this one does right now, so if we just say add together and hit save, we now have this function that allows us to add together. So we can use the shell here, which you haven't seen before, but the shell allows you to essentially run functions inside of the UI to test if things work versus having to go and write out some code. You can check it right here. So from the shell, we can now use this shell to write a query. So we can do this in a very specific way. So when you use a function, you're going to use something called call function, the name, and then any variables you might need to pass in. So in our example, we can do call function. And as you can see, we have IntelliSense here too, so we'll be able to figure out what we need. And then the name, which is add together. Then we need a comma, and then after that is the variable. So it's expecting a number, and we're going to add these two numbers together. So let's do 500, click run query, and you can see that now we have 1,000. It tells you how long it took, and you can see all the bytes in, out, query time, storage bytes read, etc., etc. So now we kind of understand a basic function. Why don't we write a function that will get a user by ID? Instead of having to write a query every time, we can call this function and reference it for an index, which will show you how to do something more complex after we write this function. So we're going to give this function a name. We're just going to call it get user by ID. We'll give it a role of server, and that means that this has to be run with either a server key or an admin key. So in this example, a server key, making sure that it's secure and we don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to clear out anything outside of the lambda, and then we're going to pass in a variable named user. And then we're going to use that to select, and we want the ref. And then from that, we need to get. So we're going to do a get query. We're going to tell them that we want to match on an index, and the index will be the one that we just created. So get by ID. And then we need to tell it the variable that the index should match on. So we do comma here and say var. We want this uppercase query function var. And then we can just put in user. And then we just make sure that we've closed all our parentheses here, which we haven't. We still need 2 more. And then we can hit save. So let's just talk, before we run this query, let's just talk about it one more time. So we're telling it that we want to make this lambda. We're going to give it a variable of user. We're then going to select the reference based upon the index get by ID. And as long as it matches this user, return that data. So if you hit save now, we go back to our shell again, and we just say call function, and then we just use this get by user ID. So we can just copy that name and drop it in here. And then we do James Perkins and hit save. And now you can see that this has run this query here, and the result took 41 milliseconds, and it has returned this reference. Now this reference is, of course, the same reference as if I was to do this and type in my name here and do the query, you'd see that this is the same reference. So 3097100, 3097100, and then the rest of the numbers. So now we have this reusable function we can basically use anywhere. So we can just keep calling this function wherever we need to find the reference ID for this collection. And if you remember correctly, we had this index that said get all to-dos by user, and we're expecting this user reference as the data point. So now we can combine a function with a request to get that data with just passing in a known factor, in this case, the user ID. So now let's see how using the shell and the function that we just created, can we get the data of all to-dos by this specific user? So then we can edit the other to-do here and add in our own ref. So just click the edit button here, and we'll just add user ref, and then we'll paste in our ref here, and then hit comma and hit save. So now we have a user ref on this one, and we also have a user ref on this one. So now that we know both of these are owned by the user, when we make this new index request, what we should see is, of course, both of those being returned by only passing in this call function as part of it. So in the previous video that I showed you how to create a request to paginate through a matched index based upon some sort of figure. Now, if you've forgotten what that looks like, let's just quickly take a look at the GitHub for that. So here is the example to give you a frame of reference if you've forgotten. So we're telling it we want to map over a paginate that matches this index, which was the to-dos index, that at least has a completed of true, and then we use that reference to get all of the data provided. So we're going to use something similar here, except from we're going to edit some of these pieces here. Instead of passing in this comma true, we can actually use our function call to pass in that data. So back in our Shell's skills lab here, we can start creating our query. So we're going to use map, and then we're going to use paginate, and then we're going to use match. So exactly the same as the previous work. And let's just neaten this up a bit so that we can match everything together. So now we have this. Inside of our match, what we're going to do is say, we want this index, and the index is going to be this get all to-dos by user. So we can put that in here. So we can say index get all to-dos by user, which matches this index, get all to-dos by user. Then we can say, okay, that's the index part, but how do we know what to do with the data? We can do call function and then say get user by ID. And if you remember, that's the function that we create here, get user by ID. And we need to just pass in a user here. So in our example, we have this user called James. So we can just do comma James underscore Perkins. So we have the map page name, and then we're going to say we're going to match on this index and call this function. And then all we need to do is use the reference that comes from this index and say ref get ref. And if we hit run query, what you'll see is here is our query and here is the data returned. And these are both of those two to-dos that we required, and it tells us how long it took and the in and out bytes. So now you can see how using an index and a call function together allows you to do complex queries, but use very simple ideas. So now we've covered GraphQL, functions, relationships, and also how to use the shell. I had an absolute blast making all of these different skills for you to learn with Fauna. Now, this is the second to last video in my Fauna series, and there'll be one next month. The next month's video is going to be a much more in-depth overlook of how you can use Fauna in a production application. It may be something in the e-commerce space, or it could be something else. Now, one more thing to note is I do have a video coming out very soon that's going to describe how I built a SaaS in 30 days using Fauna, which is not sponsored by Fauna at all. So if you're interested in how I turned a SaaS from nothing to something in 30 days, make sure you subscribe to the channel to check that one out. So until next time, see ya.